Let us begin our quiet journey into the past, into a time wrapped in both history and legend, into the soft echoes of the Trojan War. Tonight, we drift back to the ancient world, to the lands of Greece and Anatolia, where stories of kings, warriors, and gods were whispered by poets and remembered for centuries. The Trojan War, as you may know, is not just a tale of battles and destruction, it is also a story of beauty, pride, fate, and human longing. It exists somewhere between myth and memory, where history fades and poetry takes over. The war itself was said to last 10 years, but its roots stretched much deeper, entwined with the desires of gods and the choices of mortals. Before the war began, there was peace. Troy, the shining city, stood tall along the coast of Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. Its walls were high and strong, its gates guarded by warriors of great renown, and its wealth was legendary. The Greeks, across the sea, admired it but also envied it. These two worlds would soon collide, but for now, there was still calm. The poets tell us that it all began not with armies, but with a wedding. A royal wedding in the heavens, so to speak, a celebration among the gods. The mortal man, Peleus, was to wed the sea goddess, Thetis. Their union would one day bring forth a son who would be remembered for eternity, Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks. But on that day, the joy of the wedding was disturbed by a goddess who had not been invited, Eris, the goddess of strife. Eris carried with her a golden apple, shining bright like the sun. Upon it were written the words, "To the fairest." She cast it among the goddesses, and thus began the quarrel. Hera, queen of the gods, claimed it. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, demanded it as well. And Aphrodite, goddess of love, would not be denied. The three turned to Zeus, the king of the gods, but he refused to choose. Instead, he sent them to a mortal man, a prince of Troy, named Paris. Paris was not a warrior by nature. He was gentle, handsome, and raised among the hills as a shepherd. Yet the gods chose him for this decision, a decision that would change the fate of nations. Each goddess tried to bribe him. Hera offered power, the rule over vast kingdoms. Athena offered wisdom and victory in war. But Aphrodite offered something different, she promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, guided by desire, chose Aphrodite. He handed her the golden apple, and in doing so, sealed Troy's fate. For the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus. Helen was known throughout Greece for her beauty. Some said she was the daughter of Zeus himself, born from the union of the god with a mortal woman. Her beauty was so radiant that kings from every land once sought her hand. To prevent quarrels, her stepfather Tyndareus made them all swear an oath that they would respect Helen's marriage, and if anyone wronged her, they would all come together in her defense. This oath, made in peace, would one day call forth the greatest army Greece had ever known. Paris, guided by Aphrodite, traveled to Sparta as a guest. He was welcomed with warmth by Menelaus, for in those days, hospitality was sacred. Yet as the days passed, Paris looked upon Helen, and she upon him. The poets disagree whether Helen went willingly or whether she was taken, but the end was the same. Paris and Helen departed for Troy, leaving behind a broken oath, a betrayed king, and the spark of war. When Menelaus returned and found his queen gone, his heart burned with anger. He turned to his brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful of the Greek lords. Together, they called upon the oath of Helen's suitors. From every corner of Greece, kings and warriors gathered, Odysseus of Ithaca, clever and cunning, Ajax the Great, towering and strong, Nestor, the wise elder, and many others whose names still echo in stories. And among them all was Achilles, son of Peleus and Thetis, destined to become the fiercest warrior of the Greeks. The Greeks prepared their ships, 1,000 strong, to sail across the sea. Yet even in the beginning, the gods were at play. Some supported the Greeks, others the Trojans. The winds were restless, and Agamemnon, the proud commander, was told he must make a sacrifice to appease the goddess Artemis. He faced a terrible choice, one that revealed the cruelty of fate. His own daughter, Iphigenia, was demanded as the price. Some say he tricked her, calling her to be wed, only to lead her to the altar of sacrifice. Others say the goddess spared her at the last moment. Whichever tale is true, the ships soon set sail, and the Greeks crossed the wine-dark sea. And so began the long march to war. The Trojans, too, prepared. King Priam, old and noble, ruled Troy with wisdom. His sons were many, but two stood above the rest. Hector, the prince of Troy, strong and honorable, beloved by his people, and Paris, whose choice had brought them all to the edge of ruin. Yet in those early days, there was still hope. The Trojans trusted in their walls, in their warriors, and in the favor of the gods. Thus the stage was set, two great powers, drawn together by love, pride, and destiny. The war to come would be told for centuries, sung by poets, and remembered as one of the greatest tales ever told. The night grows still, and with it, we drift further into the unfolding tale of the Trojan War. The storm of destiny has been stirred, and now the great heroes of Greece are called together, drawn by oath, by loyalty, and by the subtle hand of the gods. Let us wander quietly among them, learning of their strengths, their weaknesses, and the role each would play in the long war to come. When Helen was taken from Sparta, her husband, Menelaus, wasted no time. His pride and heart were wounded, but more than that, he felt dishonored. To the Greeks, honor was everything. A man's reputation outlived his years, and to be shamed was a wound deeper than any spear could give. He turned to his brother, Agamemnon, the high king of Mycenae. Together, they resolved to gather every leader who had once sworn the oath of Helen's suitors. None could refuse without breaking their word. The first and most famous of these leaders was Achilles. He was still young when the call for war was sounded, perhaps not even 20 years old. Yet already, tales of his greatness had spread far and wide. His mother, Thetis, knew his fate, that if he went to Troy, his life would be short, but his glory everlasting. In some tellings, she tried to hide him, disguising him among maidens on the island of Scyros. But Odysseus, clever and cunning, uncovered him by laying out weapons among trinkets and jewels. When Achilles reached for the sword, his disguise was broken. The choice was made, he would go to war, and his name would live forever. Beside Achilles was his dearest companion, Patroclus, whose bond with him was closer than that of brothers. The two would share every step of the journey, though fate had its own plans for them. Then there was Odysseus himself, king of Ithaca. Unlike Achilles, he did not rush toward war. Odysseus was clever, a man of wit and words, not easily deceived. He had a young son, Telemachus, and a wife, Penelope, whom he dearly loved. He pretended madness to avoid joining the campaign, yoking an ox and a mule together to plow the fields and sowing salt instead of seed. But again, fate would not be tricked. Polymedes, another Greek leader, tested him by placing the infant Telemachus before his plow. Odysseus swerved to avoid his child, proving his sanity. Reluctantly, he joined the war, and his cunning would prove vital in the years to come. Next came Ajax the Great, towering and mighty, second only to Achilles in strength. He carried a massive shield, like a wall of bronze, and was known for his courage and honesty. Alongside him was Ajax the Lesser, smaller in size but quick and skilled with the spear. These two men would leave very different marks upon the war. From Pylus came Nestor, the wise old king. His beard was white, his voice gentle, but his wisdom was unmatched. He had seen many battles in his youth, and though his strength had faded, his counsel would guide the Greeks through hardship. Menelaus himself would take the field, determined to reclaim Helen, whether by diplomacy or by the sword. Yet it was Agamemnon who stood above them all, the commander of the host, proud and fierce, though his pride would often bring strife among his own allies. From many other lands came warriors whose names echoed in the verses of Homer, Diomedes of Argos, bold and fearless, Idomeneus of Crete, wise in leadership, and many more, until the host was vast and shining. It is said that 1,000 ships were gathered, enough to darken the sea with sails, enough to make the earth tremble when their oars struck the water in unison. But before they could depart, a shadow fell upon their cause. At Aulis, the harbor where they gathered, the winds turned against them. No matter how they tried, the ships could not sail. The seers declared that Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, was angered. They whispered that Agamemnon had offended her, boasting of his skill in the hunt or failing to honor her properly. The price for her favor was unthinkable, the life of his daughter, Iphigenia. Here the story splits, as myths often do. Some say Agamemnon, torn between love and duty, lured his daughter with the promise of marriage to Achilles, only to offer her as a sacrifice. Others say that at the last moment, Artemis showed mercy, carrying the girl away and leaving a deer in her place. Whatever the truth, the wind soon shifted, and the fleet was able to sail. But the stain of that moment lingered, a silent weight upon Agamemnon's heart. The Greeks set forth across the wine-dark sea, their sails billowing, their prows cutting through the waves. The journey was long and uncertain, for navigation was not easy in those times. Yet at last, they came to the shores of Troy. The city gleamed before them, its high walls unyielding, its towers proud against the horizon. The Trojans, seeing the fleet approach, braced themselves for the coming storm. But when the Greeks landed, they did not march straight to the walls. Instead, they scattered across the coast, raiding the nearby lands, seizing supplies, and testing their strength. Skirmishes flared, small battles that foreshadowed the greater war to come. And still, the gods watched, each choosing their side. Hera and Athena stood with the Greeks, still bitter over the judgment of Paris. Aphrodite, of course, favored the Trojans, protecting the love she had promised. Zeus, as always, sought balance, watching carefully as the scales of fate shifted. The war, though remembered as 10 years long, did not begin with grand battles. It began with hesitation, with raids and duels, with attempts at peace. For even in anger, Menelaus and Agamemnon sought to avoid needless bloodshed. Envoys were sent to Troy, asking for Helen's return. But Priam, the wise old king, loved his son Paris and would not betray him. Helen, too, remained, though in her heart she often longed for her home. The refusal sealed the war's course. There would be no peace. So the Greeks encamped by the shore, building huts and fortifications, making ready for the long struggle ahead. They had come not only for Helen but for glory, for riches, for the chance to etch their names into the memory of mankind. And the Trojans, proud and brave, would not yield their city so easily. Thus the stage was fully set. The heroes were gathered, the fleets had sailed, and the walls of Troy stood waiting. The tale was ready to unfold, each day bringing new triumphs and new sorrows. The Greek fleet had crossed the sea, their 1,000 ships riding the waves like a flock of white birds. When at last they reached the coast of Troy, the long journey gave way to the next trial, the first steps upon Trojan soil. Let us walk with them in our minds, gently, as if watching from afar, listening to the whispers of the sea and the sigh of the wind. The ships drew near the shore, their prows cutting into the sand, their warriors leaping down with shields and spears. The air was heavy with anticipation. For years, the Greeks had spoken of this day, the day they would confront Troy and demand the return of Helen. Now, they stood on foreign land, the high walls of Troy glimmering in the distance, proud and unyielding. It is said that the very first to leap ashore was Patroclus, a young and brave warrior. But with courage often comes fate's cruel hand. A prophecy had warned that the first Greek to step on Trojan soil would be the first to fall. Patroclus, eager for glory, did not hesitate. He planted his feet upon the sand, raised his spear high, and cried out for victory. Yet he did not live long to celebrate, for soon he was struck down by a Trojan defender. Thus, the war's first sacrifice was made, a reminder that this struggle would demand much blood before it was done. The Greeks buried him with honor, and his name was remembered in song. But even as sorrow touched them, their determination did not fade. They built their camp by the shore, stretching it wide with huts of timber and hides, surrounding it with ditches and walls to guard against Trojan raids. The ships, drawn up on the sand, formed a line like a forest of masts. This would be their home for the long years to come. The Trojans, from their towers, watched carefully. King Priam, old and wise, gathered his council. He was no fool, he knew the Greeks were many and mighty. Yet he also trusted in Troy's walls and in the valor of his sons. Hector, his eldest and most noble, was already the city's shield. Strong, brave, and steadfast, Hector stood ready to defend his home, his wife Andromache, and his infant son Astyanax. He carried the weight of Troy upon his shoulders, and his people loved him dearly. Beside him was Paris, the prince whose choice had begun it all. Though handsome and favored by Aphrodite, he was not his brother's equal in courage or skill. Yet his presence stirred the Greeks' anger, for he was the one who had taken Helen. And Helen herself now lived within the walls of Troy, gazing often from the battlements, her heart torn between the past she had left and the fate she could not escape. The first clashes between Greeks and Trojans were not great battles but duels and raids, tests of strength and honor. Menelaus, filled with fury, longed for Paris. He challenged him to single combat, hoping to end the war quickly. For if Paris fell and Helen was returned, the Greeks might yet sail home. The challenge was accepted, and both armies gathered to watch. Paris stood before Menelaus, his bow in hand, but his heart faltered when he saw the Spartan king's fierce eyes. He stepped back, ashamed, until his brother Hector rebuked him harshly. "Coward," Hector said, "you brought this war upon us, yet you shrink from its weight. Better that you had never been born than bring ruin to Troy." Stung by his brother's words, Paris at last stood his ground. The duel was fierce but short. Menelaus seized Paris by the helmet, dragging him down, ready to end his life. But Aphrodite, who had promised Paris love and protection, swept him away in a mist, carrying him back to the safety of Helen's chambers. Menelaus raged, but the duel was broken, and the war would not end so easily. The gods, it seemed, desired the tale to unfold more slowly, with many twists yet to come. The Greeks and Trojans returned to battle, and soon the fields outside the city rang with the clash of bronze. The dust rose, the spears flew, and the cries of warriors filled the air. Yet even in these early days, the war was not fought without mercy. Between the fighting, truces were made, bodies returned, and prayers offered to the gods. For in that time, war was both fierce and sacred, bound by rules of honor. One by one, the heroes began to reveal themselves. Diomedes, the young king of Argos, shone with extraordinary valor, cutting through Trojan ranks like fire in a field of grain. In some tales, the goddess Athena herself granted him sight beyond mortal men, allowing him to recognize the gods when they entered the battle. It is even said that he wounded Aphrodite when she came to shield her son Aeneas, sending her fleeing back to Olympus in pain and shame. Aeneas, noble prince of Troy, was another figure of destiny. Son of the goddess Aphrodite and the mortal Anchises, he fought bravely at Troy's side. Though the city would one day fall, Aeneas's story did not end there. Legends say he would survive and carry the spirit of Troy across the seas, becoming the ancestor of Rome itself. But that is another tale, far beyond the quiet shores where we now linger. As the days turned into months, the war spread across the plains. Skirmishes rose and fell, but Troy's gates remained closed, its walls too strong to breach. The Greeks grew restless, raiding the surrounding lands for supplies, taking captives, and spreading destruction. Yet Troy still stood, proud and defiant. Among the Greeks, unity did not always last. Agamemnon's pride often clashed with the wills of other kings, especially with Achilles, who would not be commanded lightly. Already, tension brewed between them, though the storm had not yet broken. For now, they fought together, their swords turned against Troy. The first year of war passed like this: raids, duels, small victories, and bitter losses. The land itself seemed to weep, its fields scarred by battle, its rivers running red. And still, the gods played their games above, favoring one side and then another, weaving fate's web tighter and tighter. The Greek camp upon the shore grew restless. Fires flickered against the night, warriors sharpened their spears, and the sound of the sea blended with the murmur of weary men. Though the war had begun with promise, and though the Greeks had landed in force, it soon became clear that Troy would not fall swiftly. Its walls stood strong, its warriors valiant, and the gods themselves seemed to weave delay into every moment. But sometimes, the greatest battles are not between enemies, but among allies. And so it was, in the long years of the Trojan War, that anger would rise within the Greek camp, not against Troy, but between two of its greatest leaders, Agamemnon, the proud high king, and Achilles, the unmatched warrior. The trouble began with a plague. Apollo, the god of the bow, sent sickness upon the Greeks. It spread through the camp, striking men down, filling the air with the groans of the suffering. The cause of the gods' anger lay in a quarrel over a woman. Chryseis, a maiden taken as a prize by Agamemnon, was the daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo. Her father came to ransom her, offering gifts, but Agamemnon spurned him cruelly. In his pride, he mocked the old man and sent him away in shame. The priest prayed to Apollo, and the god answered with fury. For days, Apollo's arrows of plague rained upon the Greeks, until their leaders gathered in council. Calchas, the seer, revealed the truth: the girl must be returned if the plague was to end. Agamemnon, though bitter and angry, had no choice but to yield. Yet his pride burned. He felt dishonored, stripped of a prize, made lesser before his men. In his anger, Agamemnon swore that if he must give up Chryseis, he would take another prize in her place, perhaps even from among the spoils of his own allies. These words stung Achilles most of all, for Achilles valued honor above all else. To be shamed, to have his glory stolen, was worse than death. The two clashed with words before the council, their voices rising like thunder. Achilles, burning with wrath, nearly drew his sword upon Agamemnon, but Athena herself descended, unseen to all but him, and stayed his hand. "Hold your anger," she whispered, "for greater glory awaits if you master yourself." Still, the fire within him did not cool. In his rage, Achilles withdrew from the war. When Agamemnon, true to his threat, took another woman, Briseis, from Achilles, the insult was complete. Achilles returned to his tent, his heart black with fury, and swore he would not fight again. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, came to him as he wept by the shore. He begged her to plead with Zeus, the king of the gods, to grant the Trojans strength until the Greeks realized how much they needed him. And so, for a time, the greatest warrior of the Greeks set down his arms. Without Achilles, the balance of war shifted. The Trojans grew bold, pushing the Greeks back, pressing them toward their ships. Hector, prince of Troy, shone in battle like a star. He drove the Greeks across the plain, his chariot wheels cutting grooves into the earth. With every victory, the Trojans gained confidence, while the Greeks felt the absence of their champion. The camp was filled with unease. Some sought to reconcile Achilles and Agamemnon, but the pride of both men was unyielding. Agamemnon felt his authority challenged, Achilles felt his honor destroyed. Neither would bend, and the war itself groaned under the weight of their quarrel. Meanwhile, the gods themselves took sides more openly. Hera and Athena, ever bitter against Paris and Aphrodite, favored the Greeks, urging them forward. But Apollo, still loyal to his priest and to Troy, aided the Trojans. Zeus himself, persuaded by Thetis, leaned toward the Trojans, at least for a time, granting them strength while Achilles remained idle. The battles raged without him. Diomedes, bold and fierce, rose to prominence. On the field, he shone so brightly that even gods felt his spear. With Athena's aid, he struck down many Trojans, and even wounded Ares, the god of war himself. The sight of a mortal challenging the divine filled the field with awe and dread. Yet still, the Trojans did not fall, for Hector's strength held them fast. In these days, Helen often watched from the walls of Troy. She looked upon the armies with sorrow, feeling herself the cause of all this bloodshed. Some say she wept, some say she longed for her homeland, others say she had come to love Paris despite all. In truth, her heart was a storm, caught between guilt, longing, and the strange pull of destiny. Back in the Greek camp, Achilles sat by the sea, apart from the fighting. His heart was torn between pride and longing. He desired to fight, for battle was his nature, but his wounded honor chained him. His companion, Patroclus, stayed at his side, offering gentle words, urging him to soften. Yet Achilles' wrath was deep, like fire smoldering beneath the earth, waiting for the moment to erupt. And so the war stretched on. The Greeks pressed forward, then faltered. The Trojans defended, then advanced. The plain outside Troy was littered with broken chariots, fallen warriors, and the scars of countless clashes. Still, the walls of Troy stood tall, and still Achilles remained apart. It is in this pause, in this waiting, that we sense the tension gathering, like the stillness before a storm. For Achilles' wrath was not only his own, it was woven into fate. His anger would shape the course of the war, bringing both ruin and glory, sorrow and remembrance. As the fires burned low in the Greek camp, men whispered his name. Some cursed him for abandoning them. Others prayed for his return. All knew that without him, their cause was weaker. And across the plain, the Trojans grew bolder, for they too knew the truth: as long as Achilles remained in his tent, Troy's hope endured. And so, dear listener, we close this chapter in quiet reflection. The greatest warrior of the Greeks has set down his arms, consumed by wrath and wounded pride. The gods stir the fates above, the Trojans surge upon the plain, and the Greeks falter. Yet the story is far from over. The anger of Achilles, though silent now, will burn brighter than ever before, and its flame will light both triumph and tragedy. Rest, then, in the hush of this moment, where pride and wrath hold the future in their hands, and the soft sound of the sea hides the storm that is soon to come. The war upon the plain stretched on, and the days fell into rhythm, the clash of bronze at dawn, the cries of warriors through the afternoon, and the flicker of campfires in the night. Yet as the Greeks grew weary without Achilles, the Trojans gained strength, their courage swelling beneath the leadership of Hector. It was in these days that Hector's glory shone brightest, like a beacon for his people and a shadow upon the hearts of the Greeks. Hector was no ordinary warrior. He was not fighting for fame, nor to carve his name into song. He fought for Troy, for his city, for his wife and child. In his heart burned the duty of a son, a brother, a husband, and a father. He bore the hopes of his people as heavily as his bronze armor, and though his steps sometimes faltered beneath the weight, his spirit did not break. The poets tell us of a day when Hector returned from battle to the high walls of Troy. There, Andromache, his beloved wife, came to meet him, holding their infant son, Astyanax. Her eyes were filled with fear, for she knew the danger he faced each day. She begged him not to return to the field, not to throw his life away. She had already lost father, mother, and brothers to the war. Hector was all she had left. Hector listened with love, his hand upon her shoulder, his gaze gentle. Yet he could not yield. No man escapes his fate, he said softly. Better to stand and fight, to win honor for Troy, than to shrink from destiny. If I fall, may it be with courage, so that my son may one day say, my father was a great man. Then he reached for the child, who shrank back from the sight of his father's helmet and plumed crest. Smiling, Hector set the helmet aside and lifted the boy in his arms, raising him toward the sky. In that quiet moment, the war fell away, and all that remained was the bond of a family and the unspoken prayer that fate might show mercy. But mercy is not often found upon the battlefield. Soon Hector returned to the field, and the war raged anew. The Trojans pressed forward with vigor. Under Hector's command, they drove the Greeks back across the plain, past the scattered chariots and broken spears, all the way to the very walls of their camp. The Greeks, without Achilles, fought bravely but without the sharp edge of invincibility. Ajax the Great held the line with his massive shield, deflecting blow after blow. Diomedes fought like a lion, his spear flashing, his strength nearly unmatched. Yet even they could not turn the tide alone. At one moment, the Trojans surged toward the Greek ships, their chariots rushing like waves. The Greeks built walls and ditches to guard their fleet, for if the ships were lost, there would be no return home. Hector, with his chariot team, was first among the attackers. He hurled his spear, struck down many foes, and seemed unstoppable. The sound of his voice carried over the battlefield, lifting the spirits of his people, who followed him like shadows. The gods, too, played their parts. Zeus favored the Trojans now, granting them strength to test the Greeks, just as Thetis had begged of him. Hera and Athena watched with anger, longing to aid their chosen warriors, but Zeus forbade them, reminding them that fate must take its course. Thus, the balance of the war leaned heavily toward Troy, and the Greeks despaired. In the camp, Agamemnon nursed his pride but also his wounds. He himself was struck in battle and forced to withdraw, along with other wounded kings. Menelaus, too, was injured, and Odysseus barely escaped death with the help of Ajax. One by one, the leaders fell back, and the Trojans pressed closer to the ships. It was then, in their hour of need, that the Greeks turned once more to Achilles. Envoys were sent to his tent, carrying rich gifts and promises. Agamemnon, at last, admitted his fault and offered treasures, women, lands, and honor if Achilles would return. Odysseus spoke with his silver tongue, urging him to think of the greater good. Phoenix, his old tutor, begged him with fatherly love. Even Ajax, plain and honest, appealed to his sense of duty. But Achilles would not bend. His heart still burned with anger, and he spoke words that chilled his allies. "What is honor," he asked, "if it can be stolen? What is glory, if it only serves another man's pride? Let them fight without me. Let them learn how much they depend upon Achilles." He refused the gifts, the pleas, even the tears of those who loved him. His wrath was unshaken. The Greeks returned to battle without him, their hopes dimmed. Hector seized the chance, leading his Trojans like a storm. Again they reached the walls of the Greek camp. Again they pressed toward the ships, their spears flashing in the sun. The sound of their war cries echoed across the plain, drowning out the sea. On one fateful day, the Trojans broke through. They set fire to a Greek ship, its flames rising like a beacon of doom. The Greeks fought desperately to push them back, and for a moment, it seemed all was lost. Yet Ajax, towering and unyielding, held the line, his shield broad as a wall. With each step, he pushed the Trojans away, buying precious time. Diomedes, though wounded, fought with fury. Menelaus, limping, still raised his sword. The plain was a storm of dust and blood, the cries of the dying mingling with the clash of bronze. And in the distance, Achilles sat apart, his heart torn between anger and duty, his mind restless. He heard the cries, he smelled the smoke, and though he did not fight, his spirit stirred. The Greeks held on by a thread, but their strength was nearly spent. All eyes turned to Hector, whose presence seemed unstoppable. His spear struck down the bravest, his chariot rolled over the fallen, and his name was cried out by his people. He was the pride of Troy, the terror of the Greeks, the warrior who seemed chosen by destiny itself. And so the balance of the war tilted once more. Without Achilles, the Greeks faltered. With Hector, the Trojans soared. The ships burned, the camp trembled, and the sea whispered of defeat. Yet the story was not finished. For in the heart of the camp, in the tent of Achilles, a choice was about to be made that would change the war forever. But for now, we leave the field as night falls. The fires of the burning ship still glow in the darkness, the Greeks wounded and weary, the Trojans triumphant and proud. The gods watch in silence, knowing that fate has not yet shown its final hand. And Achilles, the storm yet to break, sits waiting by the shore. As the quiet dawn spread its pale light across the mountains and seas of Greece, messengers began to ride out, carrying with them the solemn call to arms. The theft of Helen by Paris was not merely a personal insult to Menelaus, but a wound to the honor of all Greece. It was remembered that the suitors of Helen, years before her marriage, had sworn a mighty oath. Each man had promised to defend her marriage, whichever husband she chose, against any who dared violate it. And now, that oath was being called upon. Softly, the stories tell of these messengers traveling from one kingdom to another, stepping into the courts of powerful kings and seasoned warriors. Each was asked to join the great expedition against Troy, to restore Helen, and to defend the sacred honor of their oaths. Among the first was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. A man of cunning and wit, he was not eager to join the war. Some say that when the envoys arrived, Odysseus feigned madness, yoking a donkey and an ox together to plow his fields and scattering salt upon the earth as though it were seed. But clever as he was, his trick was seen through. One of the envoys placed Odysseus' infant son, Telemachus, before the plow. To avoid harming the child, Odysseus swerved, revealing his sanity. Thus, reluctantly, he agreed to join the war, though his heart longed more for peace and the comfort of his home than for distant battle. Another figure summoned was Achilles, the son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. Even in youth, Achilles was said to shine with unmatched strength and beauty. But Thetis, knowing the fate that awaited her son, tried to keep him from the war. She disguised him among maidens at the court of Skyros, hoping the messengers would pass him by. Yet the Greeks were not so easily deceived. Odysseus, in his cleverness, brought gifts of fine jewelry and weapons to the maidens. When Achilles, unable to resist, reached for the gleaming spear, his true identity was revealed. The call of destiny could not be denied, and so Achilles too was bound for Troy. From the lands of Pylos came Nestor, the aged king, renowned for his wisdom and experience. Though his years were many, and his body no longer as strong as it once had been, his counsel was considered more valuable than the might of many warriors. His voice would become a guiding force in the councils of the Greeks. From Salamis came Ajax the Greater, towering and broad-shouldered, a man of immense strength and steadfast courage. Alongside him came Ajax the Lesser, smaller in size but fierce in temper. Together, they would represent the fury of war in their own ways. Diomedes of Argos, young yet already famed for his bravery, also took up arms. In later battles, he would prove himself among the mightiest of all the Achaeans, fighting not only men but even daring to face gods themselves. Each summons carried weight, for each man had sworn his oath. From Mycenae itself came Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus, who accepted the role of commander over all the assembled forces. His pride was great, and though his leadership brought unity, it also sowed seeds of conflict that would later erupt among the Greeks. As the call spread across the Aegean, ships began to be readied. The harbors filled with the sound of wood being shaped, sails being woven, and armor being polished. Each king prepared his men, and soon a great host was gathering, one that would stretch across the seas like an endless tide. Yet before they could depart, the Greeks faced signs of divine intervention. Prophets warned that the gods were watching closely. Some remembered the judgment of Paris, when he had chosen Aphrodite as the fairest over Hera and Athena. In doing so, he had earned the wrath of the two slighted goddesses, who now favored the Greeks and opposed the Trojans. Still, the gods were fickle, and many feared that their journey would be shaped as much by divine will as by mortal strength. One of the most sorrowful tales comes from the summoning of Iphigenia, the daughter of Agamemnon. As the ships gathered at Aulis, ready to set sail, the winds refused to rise. The seer Calchas revealed that Artemis, goddess of the hunt, had been offended. To appease her and grant favorable winds, a terrible sacrifice was demanded. Agamemnon's daughter must be offered. The story tells of Agamemnon's deep anguish, of Iphigenia's innocent steps as she approached the altar, and of the silence of the gathered army as the deed was prepared. Some say that at the last moment, Artemis took pity, whisking Iphigenia away and replacing her with a deer. Others tell that the sacrifice was carried out, sealing Agamemnon's doom. Whatever the truth, the weight of that choice hung heavy on all who witnessed it, a reminder that the gods demanded blood as well as loyalty. At last, the winds shifted, and the great fleet set sail. The sea foamed beneath the oars of countless ships, and the cries of men rose like a storm. Mothers wept upon the shores, watching sons depart who might never return. Wives stood with quiet sorrow, uncertain if they would see their husbands again. For though the men sailed with pride and purpose, the shadow of fate stretched long across their journey. As the ships cut across the blue waters, the unity of Greece could be felt in its full power. From small islands and mighty kingdoms alike, men had gathered for one cause. The oath they had sworn bound them together, yet each carried his own hopes, his own fears, and his own destiny. Some would find eternal glory, their names remembered for centuries. Others would find only silence beneath the walls of Troy. And thus, with sails filled and hearts heavy with anticipation, the Greeks began their fateful voyage. The war that would echo through all of history was now set in motion, and the stage was prepared for heroes, for tragedy, and for the will of the gods to play out upon the earth. In the stillness of this moment, one can imagine the sea stretching endlessly before them, the sound of waves against wooden hulls, and the weight of history pressing gently upon every heart. The war had not yet begun, but already, destiny was guiding every step. The story of the Trojan War is not only about gods and their quarrels, but also about men bound by honor, promises, and the weight of destiny. As we continue our quiet journey into this ancient tale, let us drift into the moment when all of Greece began to move as one, preparing for a war that would define an age. The war did not begin in a single heartbeat. Instead, it was a chain of promises, carefully woven together, binding kings and warriors alike under one great oath, the oath that led them to Troy. Long before Paris carried Helen away, her beauty had already caused unease across Greece. Many suitors had come to Sparta, seeking her hand in marriage. From kings to noble princes, from distant islands to powerful city-states, they arrived, each one hoping to win the most beautiful woman in the world. Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, was no ordinary woman, and men knew that her hand in marriage could shift the balance of power. Her stepfather, King Tyndareus, faced a great dilemma. If he chose one suitor over the others, jealousy and rivalry could ignite civil war. He feared that no matter whom he selected, the rejected suitors might band together in resentment and destroy his kingdom. So, he turned to a clever solution, an oath crafted by Odysseus of Ithaca, the man who was already known for his wisdom and cunning mind. Odysseus himself had no desire to marry Helen. His heart was already devoted to Penelope, though their union had not yet taken place. Instead, he sought to secure peace while also ensuring favors for himself in the future. He suggested that all of Helen's suitors should swear a sacred oath, binding them to defend and uphold the marriage of Helen, no matter to whom she was given. They would promise not only loyalty, but also swift vengeance against anyone who might attempt to harm or steal her away. This was not a light oath. To swear it meant swearing before the gods, and in ancient Greece, such words carried eternal weight. The suitors agreed. They each placed their hand upon the sacrifice and swore that if Helen were ever wronged, if her marriage was ever violated, they would unite and punish the offender. With this oath sealed, Tyndareus chose Menelaus, the brother of Agamemnon, to be Helen's husband. Menelaus was strong, wealthy, and powerful, and his connection to the throne of Mycenae made him a worthy choice. The other suitors, though disappointed, had bound themselves to peace, and thus the arrangement was accepted. For a time, harmony reigned. Menelaus and Helen became king and queen of Sparta. But fate does not forget promises. When Paris came and took Helen away, it was as if a spark had fallen upon dry leaves. The oath was remembered. Across Greece, kings and warriors were reminded of their vow. Though many hesitated, none dared to break a promise sworn before the gods. And so, one by one, they prepared themselves for war. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother of Menelaus, was chosen as the commander of the entire Greek host. His wealth, power, and ambition made him the natural leader. Under his call, the greatest heroes of the age began to gather. Odysseus of Ithaca, though reluctant, was drawn in by his earlier oath. Ajax the Greater, tall and mighty, came from Salamis. His kinsman, Ajax the Lesser, followed with his swift warriors. Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, brought his sons and his deep counsel. Diomedes, a young but fearsome warrior from Argos, joined with zeal. And from Phthia came Achilles, the son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, the greatest warrior the world would ever know. Achilles was still very young, but his reputation was already unmatched. His mother had dipped him in the river Styx, leaving only his heel untouched, making him nearly invulnerable. His destiny was known, he would achieve everlasting glory, though his life would be short. His companion, Patroclus, joined him, their bond of friendship deeper than words could describe. The call of war brought together not just kings, but thousands upon thousands of soldiers. From every corner of Greece they came, bringing ships, spears, and shields. The fleet would gather at Aulis, a port on the eastern shore of Greece, where the waters stretched out toward Troy. It is said that the number of ships was so great that when they set sail, the sea itself darkened beneath their sails. Some claimed there were over 1,000 ships, though others told of fewer. Still, the phrase, "the 1,000 ships," has endured, for it captures the enormity of their purpose. Yet the gods had not forgotten their quarrels. For as the Greeks assembled, omens began to appear. At Aulis, a serpent slithered up a tree and devoured 9 sparrows, before being turned to stone. The seer Calchas, wise in prophecy, declared that the war would last 9 years, and that in the 10th year Troy would fall. This was not a quick endeavor, but a long struggle written into destiny. But there was another obstacle. The winds at Aulis refused to blow. The fleet could not set sail. Days turned into weeks, and frustration grew among the gathered warriors. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared, and doubts spread like smoke. Once again, it was Calchas who interpreted the will of the gods. The goddess Artemis, he said, was angered. Agamemnon had offended her, either by boasting of his hunting skills or by failing to give her proper tribute. To appease her, she demanded a terrible sacrifice, the life of Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia. This cruel demand placed Agamemnon in unbearable torment. He was torn between a father's love and a king's duty. If he refused, the fleet would never sail, and the oath to Menelaus would be broken. If he agreed, he would betray his child. Ancient storytellers offer different endings to this tale. In some versions, Iphigenia was indeed sacrificed, her life given to the goddess. In others, Artemis took pity and carried her away at the last moment, replacing her with a deer upon the altar. Whichever version one believes, the meaning remains the same. The war demanded not only courage, but also terrible losses, even before the Greeks reached Troy. At last, the winds changed. The ships were able to set sail, their sails swelling as the oars beat rhythmically against the waters. The fleet moved forward, a vast armada stretching across the sea. The journey had begun, and with it, the long shadow of war fell upon both Greece and Troy. As we rest here in the calm of this narration, imagine the sight, thousands of ships gliding across the Aegean, carrying men who would soon become legends. Heroes whose names would echo for thousands of years were now united by an oath, sailing toward destiny. The quiet waters of Aulis gave way to the open sea, and the song of the waves carried them ever closer to the shores of Troy. The war between the Greeks and the Trojans had now stretched into its 9th year, a long and weary struggle that wore down even the strongest of warriors. Both sides had suffered greatly, and neither could claim a lasting victory. Yet in this moment of endless fighting, one man's pride and anger threatened to shift the course of the war entirely. That man was Achilles, the greatest warrior among the Greeks. His story, filled with wrath, grief, and fate, became central to the legend of the Trojan War. Achilles was the son of Peleus, a mortal king, and Thetis, a sea goddess. His mother had tried to make him immortal when he was a child, dipping him into the waters of the river Styx. But she held him by the heel, leaving one small spot untouched by the river's magic. This single weakness would later shape his destiny. For now, though, Achilles was invincible in battle, his strength unmatched, his spear swift, his courage unshaken. Yet, for all his greatness, Achilles carried within him a fiery temper and a pride that could not easily bend. At the center of the conflict that sparked his wrath was Agamemnon, the leader of the Greek army. Agamemnon was powerful but arrogant, accustomed to having his will obeyed. He and Achilles often clashed, for both were men of strong will and quick temper. Their quarrel erupted after a dispute over war prizes, the women taken during raids, symbols of honor and glory for the warriors. Agamemnon had been forced to give up one of his prizes, a woman named Chryseis, to end the wrath of Apollo, who had sent a plague upon the Greeks. Furious at this humiliation, Agamemnon decided to claim another prize, and in doing so, he struck at Achilles himself. Agamemnon sent his heralds to seize Briseis, a woman who had been awarded to Achilles. Though she was a war prize, Achilles cared for her deeply, and her presence brought him a measure of comfort amid the endless bloodshed. When she was taken from him, it was as though Agamemnon had struck at his very heart. Achilles felt dishonored, humiliated before the entire army. His pride, already easily wounded, now burned like fire. In his fury, Achilles withdrew from the war. He returned to his tent by the ships, refusing to fight, refusing even to show himself in battle. He called upon his mother, Thetis, and begged her to intervene with Zeus, the king of the gods. Achilles asked Zeus to tilt the balance of war in favor of the Trojans, so that the Greeks would suffer defeat and realize how much they depended on him. Thetis, sorrowful at her son's anger but unable to refuse him, promised to speak to Zeus. This moment marked a great turning point in the war. For without Achilles, the Greeks lost their strongest warrior, and the Trojans, emboldened by their growing strength, pressed the attack. The battles grew fiercer, the Greeks suffered heavy losses, and despair began to spread through their camp. Yet Achilles, in his pride and wrath, stood apart, watching as his comrades fell. But though he refused to fight, Achilles did not forget his closest companion, Patroclus. Patroclus was more than a friend, he was like a brother to Achilles, a bond forged in youth and tested in war. Patroclus watched with worry as the Greeks suffered, and though he respected Achilles' anger, he longed to help their comrades in battle. The shadow of his decision would soon come to change everything. As the war raged on, the Greeks found themselves driven back to their ships. The Trojans, led by Hector, the mightiest prince of Troy, pushed them to the very edge. Fires threatened to engulf the Greek fleet, and the danger of complete destruction loomed. In this desperate moment, Patroclus approached Achilles, his voice gentle yet filled with urgency. He pleaded with his friend, reminding him of the suffering of their comrades, of the men who fought and died while Achilles remained apart. Patroclus did not demand that Achilles return to the battlefield himself, but he asked for something else, Achilles' armor. If he could wear the shining armor of his friend, the Trojans would believe that Achilles had returned to battle, and their fear might turn the tide. Reluctantly, Achilles agreed. He gave Patroclus his armor and his blessing, though he warned him not to press too far, not to seek glory beyond what was needed. Achilles' words were filled with an ominous weight, for he knew, in his heart, that fate was closing in on them both. Clad in Achilles' armor, Patroclus strode forth into battle, and the Greeks, renewed by the sight, rallied with him. The Trojans fell back in fear, believing the great warrior had returned at last. With courage blazing, Patroclus fought fiercely, driving the Trojans from the ships, saving the Greek fleet from destruction. Yet in the heat of victory, he forgot Achilles' warning. Carried away by the thrill of battle, he pursued the Trojans all the way to the gates of Troy. There, beneath the walls of the city, fate awaited him. Hector, the prince of Troy, confronted Patroclus. A fierce battle followed, and though Patroclus fought bravely, he could not withstand Hector's strength. Hector slew him, striking down the man who wore Achilles' armor. Only afterward did Hector realize it was not Achilles he had killed, but his beloved companion. The death of Patroclus sent a shockwave through the Greek camp, and when word reached Achilles, his heart shattered. Grief overwhelmed him, grief deeper and more consuming than any pride or anger he had known. He fell to the ground, tearing his hair, his cries echoing through the camp. His wrath, once aimed at Agamemnon, now turned with full fury upon Hector and the Trojans. Achilles' rage was no longer born of pride alone, but of love and loss, a grief that demanded vengeance. The war that had dragged on for years now burned with new fire, and the gods themselves trembled, for they knew that when Achilles returned to battle, blood and sorrow would follow. And so, the stage was set. The wrath of Achilles, long smoldering, had been fully awakened. It would not rest until it had consumed Hector, Troy's brightest hope, and in its course, it would shape the fate of the war itself. As the night fell over the plain of Troy, the air heavy with mourning and anticipation, the Greeks waited for the storm that was sure to come. For when Achilles rose again, no man could stand against him, and even the walls of Troy would tremble before his fury. As the Trojan War entered its early years, the battlefield became a place of endless cries, clashing spears, and weary soldiers. Yet, amid this chaos, there was one moment when the conflict seemed to pause, when destiny focused its gaze not on the thousands, but on just two men. This was the duel between Paris of Troy, the handsome prince who had taken Helen, and Menelaus of Sparta, her husband, who had come across the seas to win her back. The story of their duel is one of honor, pride, and the tension between human courage and divine interference. To the Greeks and Trojans alike, it was a chance to end the war before it stretched into a long and merciless struggle. The armies gathered on the plain between Troy's walls and the Greek camp. Dust rose with the marching feet of men, and the air shimmered with the heat of the sun. Both sides formed their lines, the Trojans with their bronze shields gleaming beneath the city's watchful towers, and the Greeks with their strong ranks, spears upright like a forest of wood and iron. Paris stepped forward from the Trojan side. He wore fine armor, polished and ornate, and he carried a bow slung across his back along with a gleaming spear. His beauty, said to rival the gods themselves, drew whispers even from his enemies. Yet beneath his charm was arrogance, and some say even fear. Still, he called out to the Greeks, declaring that he would fight one man to decide the fate of the war. When Menelaus heard this, his heart blazed with anger and determination. He leapt from the Greek ranks, eager to face the man who had stolen his wife. His armor shone, his grip steady on his spear. To Menelaus, this was more than a duel, it was justice, and perhaps even revenge. Before the clash could begin, heralds from both sides stepped forward. They called for silence, and the armies held their breath. A truce was agreed upon. If Menelaus won, Helen would be returned to him and the war would end. If Paris triumphed, Helen would remain in Troy, and the Greeks would sail home in defeat. The gods, however, looked down with keen interest, for in this war they saw reflections of their own rivalries. On Olympus, Hera and Athena, who despised Paris for his judgment during the fateful contest of the Golden Apple, wished for Menelaus to win. Aphrodite, protector of Paris and goddess of love, prayed for her favorite to survive. The duel began with ceremony. Priam, the aged king of Troy, was called from the safety of the city to witness the oath. He sat beneath the walls, surrounded by elders, watching as the champions prepared to fight for the fate of his people. Though he had long wished to avoid the war, he knew now that the gods had bound them to this struggle. Paris and Menelaus armed themselves and advanced into the open space between the two armies. The silence was heavy, broken only by the cries of gulls overhead and the distant clatter of armor. Then, at last, Menelaus raised his spear and hurled it with all his strength. The weapon struck Paris's shield, piercing it but not his body. With quick movements, Paris cast his spear in return, but Menelaus's armor turned it aside. The clash grew fiercer. Menelaus charged, sword drawn, and with a mighty blow he shattered Paris's shield. His sword struck against Paris's helmet, nearly breaking through, and the Trojan prince staggered, dazed and desperate. Menelaus seized him by the crest of his helmet and dragged him toward the Greek lines, intent on ending the war with his hands. The Trojans groaned in despair as they watched their prince nearly taken. But the gods did not permit such an ending. Aphrodite, watching from the heavens, could not let her chosen one fall. As Menelaus pulled Paris by the helmet strap, the leather suddenly snapped, not by chance, but by divine will. Paris slipped free and staggered back. Before Menelaus could seize him again, a mist enveloped the Trojan prince, and in an instant he vanished from the battlefield. Aphrodite had whisked him away to the safety of his chamber in Troy. Menelaus, enraged, searched for his enemy. He cast his eyes across the field, demanding that Paris be returned, but no man could find him. The Greeks shouted in triumph, declaring Menelaus the victor by default, but the Trojans murmured uneasily. The truce had been broken by the interference of the gods, and the war could not end so simply. Meanwhile, Paris lay hidden within his palace chamber, shaken yet alive. Helen, brought to him by Aphrodite's command, looked upon him with a mixture of scorn and sorrow. For though Paris was saved, it was not by his courage but by the hand of the goddess. Helen is said to have rebuked him, reminding him of the shame he brought upon them both. Still, the war would continue, and the burden of his choice, the choice to take her from Sparta, remained heavy. On the battlefield, the armies stirred with uncertainty. The Greeks felt cheated, robbed of the justice they were promised. The Trojans, though relieved that Paris lived, could not ignore the dishonor of his escape. And above them all, the gods quarreled, their rivalries shaping the fates of men. Hera and Athena fumed at Aphrodite's interference, while Zeus, ever cautious, sought to keep balance among the immortals. Thus, the duel that might have ended the Trojan War instead deepened it. Both sides prepared once again for battle, the fragile truce shattered. The warriors lifted their spears, tightened their shields, and marched forward once more into the storm of war. For the men of both armies, the brief hope of peace was gone, and the war that had begun for a single woman would now stretch into years of blood and sorrow. Yet in that duel, we see not only the courage of two men, but the hand of destiny itself, reminding us that in the world of gods and mortals, no fate is ever decided by men alone. And so, the battle would rage on. The war between the Greeks and the Trojans had raged fiercely, yet amid the chaos, a moment arrived that promised a pause, a duel between two men whose conflict had started it all. Paris, the prince of Troy, who had carried Helen away, and Menelaus, the king of Sparta, whose honor had been wounded, were now to face one another in single combat. The idea came from Hector, noble brother of Paris, who sought a way to end the endless bloodshed. He stood tall upon the battlefield and proposed that rather than countless men losing their lives, let the quarrel be settled by the very two who had caused it. His voice rang clear, yet calm, and the armies on both sides listened. A hush fell over the plain of Troy as his words reached the ears of both Greeks and Trojans. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother to Menelaus, heard this proposal and agreed. He too was weary of endless fighting, and though he burned with anger, he welcomed the chance to see his brother's honor restored. And so, the duel was set. Paris stepped forward. Though he was handsome and favored by Aphrodite, his heart trembled as he looked upon Menelaus, a warrior seasoned and hardened by years of battle. Menelaus glared at him with the fire of vengeance. It was said that if he could kill Paris, Helen would be returned, and the war might end. The battlefield grew still. Two armies, Greek and Trojan alike, watched in silence. Even the winds that blew across the plain seemed gentler, as though the world itself wished to see the outcome. The duel was not simply between two men, it was between pride and insult, love and honor, and the fate of nations rested upon its result. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the two combatants armed themselves. Paris, guided by Aphrodite's blessing, wore shining armor, though his courage wavered. Menelaus, steady and sure, tightened the straps of his greaves and grasped his spear with firm hands. He prayed to Zeus for justice, that the man who had wronged him might fall beneath his strike. When the duel began, Menelaus advanced with ferocity. His spear flew first, striking the shield of Paris and nearly piercing through. The Trojans gasped, for they saw the weakness of their prince before the might of his opponent. Paris, in return, hurled his spear, yet it glanced off Menelaus's shield without harm. Their swords clashed, ringing like thunder, and Menelaus pressed forward with strength and fury. At last, Menelaus caught Paris by the crest of his helmet. With great force, he dragged him down, choking him beneath the strap that fastened it to his chin. The Greeks shouted in triumph, believing that Paris would soon be slain and the war ended. Menelaus raised his blade, preparing for the final blow. But the gods, as ever, intervened. Aphrodite, who favored Paris, could not allow her chosen one to perish. With invisible hands, she broke the strap of the helmet and wrapped Paris in a mist. In the blink of an eye, he was whisked away from the battlefield, transported back within the walls of Troy to the safety of his chamber. Menelaus stood upon the field, furious, searching for his enemy. He called out, demanding that Paris return and face him, but no answer came. The Trojans, seeing what had happened, murmured among themselves. Some cursed Paris for his cowardice, ashamed that he had fled while others died for him. Meanwhile, within the walls of Troy, Aphrodite led Paris back to Helen. She placed him gently upon his couch, urging him to rest and be comforted by his wife's beauty. Helen, however, was filled with shame. She scorned Paris for his weakness, telling him that he should have died on the battlefield rather than flee. But Paris, beguiled by Aphrodite's power, soothed her with words and drew her into his arms. Though her heart still longed for Menelaus, the will of the goddess bound her to remain. Back on the plain, Agamemnon rose and declared that victory had been won by Menelaus, for Paris had been defeated and vanished. He demanded that the Trojans honor their promise, return Helen and end the war. The Greeks lifted their voices in approval, believing the matter settled. Yet the gods were not done. Hera and Athena, who despised the Trojans, whispered among themselves. They could not bear to see the war end so swiftly, for they desired the utter ruin of Troy. And so, they went to stir mischief. Athena, disguised in mortal form, approached the Trojan archer Pandarus. She whispered into his ear that he should take up his bow and fire an arrow at Menelaus. By doing so, she said, he would win great honor. Pandarus, deceived, obeyed. He strung his bow and released an arrow that flew across the battlefield. It struck Menelaus, wounding him in the flesh, though not fatally. The Greeks roared in outrage, for the truce had been broken. Blood had been shed once more. The fragile peace dissolved in an instant, and the battle was renewed with greater fury than before. Swords clashed, spears flew, and the cries of men filled the air. The duel that might have ended the war had instead kindled it anew, for the will of the gods was stronger than the hopes of mortals. And so, the Trojan War continued. But let us pause here, in the stillness between the echoes of clashing blades. Imagine the sight of that duel, the shining armor, the tense silence of two armies, the fierce strike of Menelaus, and the sudden vanishing of Paris. See the way fate intervenes, never allowing mortals to guide their own path fully, for the gods pull the threads unseen. In this moment, we are reminded that the war was never simply about men or their quarrels. It was about forces greater than themselves, divine rivalries, ancient prophecies, and the weaving of destiny. And though mortals fought and bled, they were but pieces upon the board of Olympus, moved by hands that cared little for their suffering. The duel of Paris and Menelaus, though brief, became a symbol. It showed both the courage of Menelaus and the frailty of Paris. It showed how the gods shielded their favorites, even against justice. And it revealed how fragile peace could be, how quickly hope could be broken by the ambition of one, or the whim of a goddess. As the sun began its slow descent that day, the field of Troy was once again drenched in the sounds of battle. The duel had changed nothing, save to remind the Greeks and the Trojans alike that their fates were bound not by promises or truces, but by the unyielding hand of destiny. And thus, the war raged on, its end still far beyond the horizon. The Trojan War, though a grand struggle of heroes and kings, was also marked by deep tensions within the Greek ranks. For victory to be won, unity was needed, but the Greeks often found themselves at odds with one another. Nowhere was this clearer than in the bitter conflict between their most powerful warrior, Achilles, and their high king, Agamemnon. This quarrel would change the course of the war, altering not only the fate of Troy but also the destinies of all who fought before its walls. Tonight, let us softly step into this episode, where pride and anger clashed, and the silence of friendship was broken by thunderous words. The Greek army had long camped on Trojan shores, raiding nearby towns and villages to secure supplies. From these raids, warriors claimed spoils, treasures, cattle, and captives. Among these captives were women taken as prizes, a grim custom of war. One such woman was Chryseis, given to Agamemnon as his prize. Her father, Chryses, a priest of Apollo, came to ransom her, offering gold for her freedom. Yet Agamemnon, in his pride, scorned the old man and drove him away harshly. The insult was not forgotten. Chryses prayed to Apollo, and the god of the silver bow heard his plea. Arrows of plague fell upon the Greek camp. Day after day, warriors and servants alike perished, their pyres smoking endlessly beside the sea. Panic and despair spread like wildfire, and at last, the leaders gathered to find a solution. Calchas, the seer, revealed that the plague would not cease until Agamemnon returned Chryseis without ransom, and offered sacrifices to Apollo. The words stung Agamemnon deeply. He was not accustomed to being commanded, even by prophecy. His pride flared in anger, yet he had no choice, for the suffering of the army could not be ignored. With bitter reluctance, he agreed to return Chryseis, but in doing so, he declared that he would not be dishonored. If his prize was taken, then he would seize another, perhaps from Ajax, perhaps from Odysseus, or perhaps, most dangerously, from Achilles himself. His threat was like a spark cast into dry grass, waiting for a strong wind to ignite it. Achilles, seated among the council, could not remain silent. His voice, sharp yet steady, rose in protest. He spoke not only against Agamemnon's words but against his arrogance. Achilles reminded him that all warriors fought for the sake of glory, not for insult, and that no leader should treat his comrades with disdain. But Agamemnon's pride could not be checked. He turned his fury upon Achilles, accusing him of insolence. Words grew harsher, each cutting deeper than the last. Then Agamemnon crossed the line that none had expected. He declared he would take from Achilles the woman Briseis, his own prize of war, to show that no man, not even the greatest warrior, could defy the king. Achilles' heart blazed with wrath. Never before had he been so humiliated. To a warrior like him, honor was life itself, and to be shamed before his peers was unbearable. He rose, hand gripping his sword, his eyes flashing with the thought of striking down Agamemnon then and there. The council trembled in silence. Yet, in that moment, the goddess Athena appeared unseen to all but Achilles. She restrained him gently, whispering that he must not spill the blood of a king. His fury would find its course another way. With effort, Achilles sheathed his blade, but his voice still thundered in rage. He declared before all that he would fight no more for the Greeks. Let them face the Trojans without him. Let them learn how much they relied upon his strength. With that, he stormed away from the council, his heart burning with wrath. True to his word, when Agamemnon's men came to claim Briseis, Achilles did not resist. He handed her over silently, but his silence was heavier than any curse. He withdrew to his tent, refusing to fight, refusing to lead, his spear idle, his armor unworn. The Greek camp grew tense with his absence. For though many were brave, none matched Achilles in skill or might. Without him, their edge against Troy dulled, their victories faltered, and fear began to creep among them. Agamemnon, though he had asserted his authority, had weakened his own cause, for pride had blinded him to the need for harmony. In his tent, Achilles sat by the shore, gazing across the dark waters. His heart was torn between rage and sorrow, between the call of honor and the sting of insult. At last, in bitterness, he lifted his hands to the heavens and called upon his mother, the sea goddess Thetis. She heard his cry, rising from the deep, her voice gentle yet filled with concern. To her, Achilles poured out his anger, telling her of Agamemnon's dishonor. He begged her to plead with Zeus, king of the gods, to tilt the scales of war in favor of Troy. Only when the Greeks suffered would they understand the price of dishonoring their greatest warrior. Thetis, though sorrowful at his request, promised to speak to Zeus. She knew the path would bring much pain, but she could not deny her son. With that, she vanished into the sea, leaving Achilles to his solitude. Thus, the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon was not merely a clash of pride. It was a turning point, a fracture in the Greek cause. From this wound would flow sorrow, defeat, and death, for when unity is broken, even the mightiest of armies may falter. The war still raged on, but without Achilles, the tide began to shift, and dark clouds gathered over the Greek host. And so we pause here, in the quiet aftermath of anger, where silence feels heavier than the clash of swords, and the absence of one man begins to reshape the fate of thousands. The war stretched on, and as the days blended together under the burning sun of the plains before Troy, both Greeks and Trojans sought a moment of decision. Countless battles had been fought, yet the walls of Troy still stood tall and unbroken. Neither side wished to surrender, yet neither could endure the endless loss of lives without hope of closure. It was then that a challenge was raised, one that would be remembered in quiet tales for centuries. Hector, the prince of Troy and defender of its people, proposed a duel. One man from the Greek army would face him, alone, in combat. It was an ancient way of settling conflict, where the outcome of one fight might sway the spirits of thousands. The Greek leaders gathered, each man considering the honor of stepping forward. There were murmurs through their ranks, whispers of fear, and whispers of pride. Hector's name carried weight. He was known as a noble warrior, brave, and honorable, but also deadly. No man underestimated him. Yet pride and glory were powerful forces among the Greeks, and soon 9 of their greatest heroes volunteered. A lottery was cast, and fate fell upon Ajax, son of Telamon, a towering figure among the Achaeans, known for his immense strength and his unwavering courage. His comrades looked upon him with respect, for Ajax was not a man of many words, but one of action, a shield as wide as a wall and a spear strong enough to pierce the heaviest of armor. When the news reached Hector, he did not flinch. He prepared himself for the duel, not with boastful words, but with the calm acceptance of duty. He armed himself in shining bronze, his helmet crested with horsehair that caught the sunlight, making him appear almost as a god. He stepped forward from the Trojan lines, and Ajax advanced from the Greek side, their armies falling silent in anticipation. It was as if the very winds hushed, waiting to see what would unfold between these two mighty men. The duel began with words, for such was the custom of the time. Hector spoke first, his tone carrying both pride and fairness. He declared that they would fight bravely, but that when the battle ended, the victor would return the fallen's body to his people, so that no dishonor would follow. This was a solemn promise, a reminder that even amid bloodshed, honor remained. Ajax agreed, and the men raised their spears. The first throws clashed against shields, the sound echoing across the plain like thunder. Hector's spear struck but did not pierce the shield of Ajax, for it was a fortress of hide and bronze. Ajax's weapon hurled in return, grazing Hector's armor but not wounding him. Then they closed the distance, spears in hand, shields pressed forward, like two mighty oak trees clashing in a storm. The crowd of soldiers watched with breath held, for this was no ordinary contest. This was a test of strength, courage, and the will of the gods. The battle raged on, each man striking and parrying, neither giving way. At one moment, Hector's spear scraped against Ajax's neck, drawing blood but not ending the fight. In another, Ajax drove Hector back with such force that he tumbled to the ground, yet Hector rose again, unbroken. Their armor rang with the strikes, sparks flying as bronze clashed upon bronze. Dust rose from the earth beneath their feet, swirling around them as if the very land bore witness to their struggle. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows, and still the duel went on. Sweat gleamed upon their brows, muscles straining, but neither yielded. Their men cried out encouragement, Greeks calling the name of Ajax, Trojans calling the name of Hector, yet both fighters heard only the sound of their own breath and the ringing of weapons. At last, as the night began to fall, heralds stepped between them, declaring that darkness had claimed the day. It was forbidden to fight under night's cover, for no gods would bless such a contest. The duel was called a draw. Hector and Ajax, though weary and battered, lowered their arms. There was no hatred in their eyes, only respect. They exchanged gifts, a symbol of their shared honor. Hector gave Ajax a sword with a silver hilt, and Ajax gave Hector a great purple belt. These offerings were not tokens of weakness but of acknowledgement, for both men knew that they had stood against a worthy opponent, one who fought not from vanity but from duty. The armies, both Greek and Trojan, marveled at this display, for in the midst of endless war, two champions had shown that nobility and humanity could still endure. The soldiers returned to their camps, murmuring about the duel, their hearts stirred not only by the clash of strength but by the moment of peace that followed. For a brief time, hatred softened. Men who had lifted swords against one another felt a quiet reminder of the bonds they all shared as mortals, fear of death, hope for glory, and love for their families far away. War would continue, yet the duel lingered in memory, a rare moment where honor shone brighter than bloodshed. That night, under the stars, Hector returned to Troy, his people welcoming him as their defender. Yet even in his triumph, his heart carried a weight, for he knew this war was far from over, and greater trials lay ahead. Ajax, too, returned to the Greek camp, silent but respected, his towering frame resting at last, his comrades knowing they had in him a shield against despair. Both men had walked through the fire of combat and had come out with their dignity intact. Thus ended the duel of Hector and Ajax, not with death, but with the recognition that even enemies could see each other as men of honor. It was a story that would echo in the whispers of history, soothing and sorrowful, a reminder that war is not only a clash of swords, but a struggle of hearts. The war had dragged on for many long years, and though both the Greeks and the Trojans suffered greatly, there had been no true end in sight. The gods continued to interfere, stirring events and manipulating outcomes, but much of the struggle still rested on the hearts and choices of mortals. At the very center of this great conflict stood Achilles, the mightiest of the Greek warriors. His skill, his fury, and his pride made him both a hero and a danger, and in the 13th chapter of our soft tale, we turn to the storm that would soon engulf the battlefield, the wrath of Achilles. For many months, Achilles had remained absent from the fighting. His quarrel with Agamemnon, born from pride and insult, had kept him away, and though the Greeks begged for his return, he stayed within his camp, brooding in silence. During this time, the Trojans gained strength and pressed the Greeks hard, driving them back to the very walls of their ships. Still, Achilles would not yield. He had been dishonored, and his heart burned with resentment. Yet there was one soul who could stir him more deeply than anger, his dearest companion, Patroclus. Patroclus was gentle where Achilles was fierce, kind where Achilles was proud. Together, they were inseparable, and though Achilles held himself apart from the war, he still watched with worry as the Greeks faltered. Patroclus, seeing the danger, begged his friend to act. "If you will not fight," Patroclus pleaded, "then let me wear your armor. Let me lead the Myrmidons into battle, so that the Trojans will think you have returned. They will fall back in fear, and we will save the ships." Achilles listened in silence. His pride still held him back, yet his heart could not ignore the suffering of his people or the earnestness of Patroclus's voice. Slowly, Achilles nodded. "Take my armor," he said, "and lead my men. Strike fear into the Trojans, and drive them away from the ships. But hear me, Patroclus, do not go too far. Do not seek glory by storming the walls of Troy. Drive them back, but then return to me." Patroclus bowed, filled with both joy and determination. He armed himself in Achilles' shining armor, the sight of which made the Greek soldiers cry out with hope. The Trojans, when they saw the figure upon the battlefield, believed Achilles himself had returned, and panic spread through their ranks. With the Myrmidons at his side, Patroclus drove the Trojans back, cutting them down with ferocity. The Greeks rallied, pushing forward with new strength. In the heat of battle, Patroclus shone like a star. He struck down Sarpedon, son of Zeus, a warrior of great renown. Yet even as the Trojans fled, Patroclus forgot the warning of Achilles. His heart surged with pride, and he pressed further, driving the enemy back to the very gates of Troy. There, fate awaited him. For at the gates stood Hector, the greatest defender of Troy. Hector, noble and brave, saw the false Achilles and stepped forth to challenge him. The two clashed, the sound of their battle echoing like thunder. But Patroclus was not the true Achilles. His strength, though great, could not match Hector's skill upon the walls of Troy. And with the aid of Apollo, who struck Patroclus from behind and stunned him, Hector found his opening. He drove his spear deep into Patroclus's body, and the friend of Achilles fell. As Patroclus lay dying, his voice rose, soft yet filled with prophecy. "Hector," he whispered, "you may have slain me, but your fate is sealed. Soon you too shall fall, and it will be Achilles who brings your death." With those words, Patroclus breathed his last, and Hector stripped the shining armor from his body, claiming it as his own. News of Patroclus's death spread quickly, and when it reached Achilles, it was as though a fire had been set within his soul. He cried out in anguish, tearing his hair, his voice shaking the camp. Grief consumed him, grief and fury unlike any the Greeks had ever seen. He wept, cradling the thought of his fallen friend, cursing himself for not joining the battle, for not protecting the one he loved most. And soon, his grief turned to rage. Achilles swore vengeance. He no longer cared for pride or insult. His quarrel with Agamemnon was meaningless in the face of Patroclus's death. All that mattered was Hector, the man who had struck down his dearest companion. "By this spear," Achilles cried, "I swear Hector shall pay. No walls, no gods, no army shall protect him from my wrath." But first, Achilles needed armor. For Hector had stripped his own, and the hero could not fight without it. It was then that his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, rose from the waves to comfort him. She held him in her arms, soothing his sorrow, though she too knew his fate. For it had long been foretold that if Achilles returned to battle, he would not live to see the war's end. "If you go back to the fight," Thetis warned, "your glory will be everlasting, but your life will be cut short." Achilles did not waver. "Let it be so," he said. "For I would rather die young, with honor and vengeance, than live long without Patroclus." Hearing his resolve, Thetis went to the forge of Hephaestus, the god of fire and craftsmanship. There, the divine smith fashioned a new set of armor for Achilles, armor more radiant than any seen before. The shield was a marvel, crafted with images of the world itself, cities, fields, stars, and seas, symbols of both war and peace, of life and eternity. When Thetis brought the armor to her son, its light blazed like the sun, and all who saw it trembled. Achilles took up the armor, his eyes burning with determination. His men, the Myrmidons, gathered around him, ready to follow him into the storm. The Greeks rejoiced, for at last their mightiest warrior had returned. But even as they celebrated, a chill lingered in the air, for they knew the wrath of Achilles would not only bring victory, it would also bring death and sorrow unlike any they had yet seen. Thus, the stage was set. Hector stood within the walls of Troy, wearing the stolen armor of Achilles. And Achilles himself, clad in god-forged mail, burned with vengeance, ready to unleash his fury. The war, already cruel and long, was about to enter its darkest and most tragic chapter. The war had dragged on for years, and both sides, weary of the endless battles, sought any opportunity to gain an advantage. By now, the Greeks and the Trojans had grown accustomed to the rhythms of conflict, the morning skirmishes, the fierce clashes by the gates, and the retreats at dusk when warriors returned to their tents or city walls. Yet, amid these routines, there were nights when rest did not come, nights when the war shifted from daylight's clamor to midnight's shadows. This chapter brings us to those tense hours, the silent raids, the whispered conspiracies, and the daring acts that unfolded under the cloak of darkness. As the firelight flickered across the Greek camp, the air was filled with the low hum of exhausted soldiers murmuring prayers or sharing faint songs to ease their fatigue. But not all were willing to sleep. For some, night was not a time of peace. It was an opening, a chance to strike unseen, to unsettle the enemy, and to remind them that the war did not truly pause when the sun set. One such night belonged to Diomedes and Odysseus, two of the most cunning and fearless warriors of the Greek host. They were not merely men of strength, they were men of wit, strategy, and an appetite for danger. The Greeks, encouraged by their valor, entrusted them with a daring task, to slip into the darkness and uncover Trojan plans, to weaken the foe not with a full assault, but with the precision of silent strikes. The night was quiet, broken only by the soft lapping of waves against the shore and the distant crackling of campfires. Diomedes and Odysseus cloaked themselves in shadows, moving beyond the safety of their lines. Each step was deliberate, every breath measured. In that stillness, the sounds of the night seemed louder than the war cries of battle, the rustle of grass, the hoot of an owl, the crunch of dirt beneath their sandals. As they crept closer to the Trojan camp, fate delivered them a gift. A lone man approached from the direction of Troy. His name was Dolan, a Trojan scout sent to spy on the Greeks. Draped in a wolfskin cloak, he moved swiftly yet nervously, hoping to return with intelligence that would aid his people. But under the gaze of the gods, his path crossed with that of Diomedes and Odysseus. The Greeks pounced like hunters in the wild. Dolan froze, caught between fear and defiance. He pleaded for his life, promising to reveal secrets if only they would spare him. Odysseus, ever cunning, assured him of mercy if he spoke truthfully. Desperate, Dolan poured out what he knew, the positions of the Trojan allies, the movements within the camp, and most importantly, the location of the newly arrived Thracian king, Rhesus, whose horses were said to be swift as the wind and destined, by prophecy, never to fall into Greek hands. But mercy was not to be Dolan's fate. Once his usefulness ended, Diomedes swiftly silenced him, ensuring his secrets would remain with the Greeks alone. Such was the harsh reality of war, trust was fleeting, and survival demanded ruthless decisions. Guided by Dolan's revelations, the two Greek heroes made their way to the Thracian camp. The Thracians, weary from travel, slept soundly, unaware of the danger that crept among them. Diomedes, like a lion among sheep, struck with deadly precision. Warrior after warrior fell beneath his blade, silent in their final moments, until the Thracian king himself lay slain. Meanwhile, Odysseus guided the prized horses, leading them quietly away from the camp. The raid was swift, brutal, and effective. By the time the Trojans realized what had happened, the Greeks were already retreating into the safety of their lines, the Thracians destroyed, their legendary horses now a trophy of Greek cunning. The night had belonged to shadows, and the Greeks awoke at dawn not only with new strength but also with renewed hope, for even in the long years of stalemate, victory could come in unexpected forms. Yet the Trojans, too, had their moments of daring beneath the stars. There were nights when their warriors sought to surprise the Greeks, to creep toward their ships, or to burn their supplies. Each side understood that the cover of darkness could shift the balance of war in ways 1,000 spears could not. For the soldiers, nights became uneasy. Sleep came lightly, if at all, for any sound in the stillness could be the enemy approaching. A snapping twig, a whisper of footsteps, the faint creak of a bowstring, it all carried the weight of dread. Torches burned longer, guards stood tenser, and dreams were haunted not only by the day's battles but by the fear of what might come before morning. But amid this fear, there was also an intimacy to the night. In those hours, warriors spoke quietly of home, of families far away, of wives and children they might never see again. The stars above seemed the same as those that shone over their homelands, a silent reminder that though divided by war, they all belonged to the same sky. In this way, the Trojan War was not only a clash of arms but also a battle of patience, of endurance, and of the human spirit to adapt even in darkness. The night raids revealed not just courage but cunning, not just strength but strategy. They were whispers of war rather than its roar, and yet they carried weight enough to shift the course of fate. And so, as we reflect on this chapter of the war, let us soften the noise of battle and linger instead in the quiet tension of those nights. Imagine the flickering fires, the restless guards scanning the horizon, the silent steps of warriors moving unseen, and the heavy stillness that pressed upon every camp. The Trojan War, though remembered for its grand battles and noble heroes, was also shaped by these moments of shadow, where victory was sought not by sunlight but by starlight. The raids of Diomedes and Odysseus would be sung of for generations, a testament to their bravery and cunning. But they also remind us of the fragile line between survival and loss, between heroism and ruthlessness, and between the peace of sleep and the dread of waking to chaos. The war had stretched on, day after day, with both sides weary from the long struggle. Yet in this moment of history, there rose a duel that would echo forever in the memory of humankind. It was the clash between Hector, the noble defender of Troy, and Achilles, the unmatched warrior of the Greeks. Let us drift gently into this story, told softly, as though by candlelight, when the world is still, and only the faint murmur of the past can be heard. The city of Troy had endured many assaults. Its walls, high and proud, still stood against the Greeks. But within, hearts were heavy. Priam, the aged king, prayed for protection over his people. Hecuba, the queen, trembled for the safety of her sons. And Andromache, wife of Hector, felt her heart break with each sound of battle that reached her ears. For she knew that her husband bore the weight of Troy upon his shoulders. Hector was not only a warrior, he was a father, a husband, and a man who loved his city more than life itself. But fate had already begun to weave its threads. The death of Patroclus, dear companion of Achilles, had set in motion a storm that no man could stop. Achilles, once withdrawn in anger, now burned with vengeance. His heart was ablaze, and his wrath was unrelenting. He donned armor forged by the god Hephaestus, gleaming like fire, and he made his way back to the field of war. The Greeks rallied at his presence, for they knew their greatest champion had returned. The Trojans, however, felt fear. When Achilles appeared upon the battlefield, his very presence struck terror into their souls. The sun glinted off his armor, and his voice rang out like thunder. He cut down warrior after warrior, his spear moving with the swiftness of the wind. No one could stand before him. The plain before Troy became a place of dread. And yet, in the heart of Troy, Hector prepared himself. He alone would face Achilles, for he could not allow fear to consume his people. As Hector stood upon the wall, gazing out at the battlefield, Andromache came to him. She held their young son, Astyanax, in her arms, and her voice trembled as she begged him not to go. "Stay within the walls," she pleaded softly. "Do not face him. If you fall, Troy will lose its heart. I will lose my husband, and our child will lose his father." Her words were heavy with love and sorrow. But Hector, gentle in his strength, placed his hand upon her shoulder and spoke calmly. "I must go, my beloved. If I hide, if I shrink away, the city will lose hope. My honor, my duty, and my love for Troy leave me no choice." He kissed her forehead, embraced his son, and walked toward his fate. The gates of Troy opened, and Hector stepped onto the plain. The air was still for a moment, as though even the gods themselves were watching. Across the field, Achilles saw him and advanced, his armor gleaming with divine fire. Their duel was about to begin. Hector felt the weight of dread, yet he stood tall. For a brief instant, fear overcame him, and he turned to run around the walls of Troy. Achilles pursued, swift as the wind. 3 times they circled the city, one chasing, the other fleeing, until at last, the gods intervened. Athena, in the guise of Hector's brother, appeared before him and urged him to stand and fight. Believing he was no longer alone, Hector turned to face Achilles. The two warriors stood before each other, the greatest of Troy and the mightiest of Greece. The world seemed to hold its breath. Hector spoke first, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "Let us make an oath, Achilles. If I fall, return my body to my family. Let there be honor in death." But Achilles, his rage unyielding, refused. His words were cold. "There can be no oaths between lions and men. You shall not escape me." And so, their battle began. Hector cast his spear, but it struck only Achilles' shield, ringing out like a hollow song. He reached for another, but none remained. Achilles hurled his own spear, and though it missed, Athena returned it to his hand unseen. Hector, realizing the gods had abandoned him, knew his fate was sealed. Still, he raised his sword and rushed forward, brave to the very end. But Achilles struck, his spear piercing Hector's neck. The defender of Troy fell upon the earth, his lifeblood soaking into the soil. Even in his final moments, Hector spoke with dignity. He begged Achilles once more to allow his body to be returned to Troy, so that his people might honor him in burial. But Achilles, blinded by wrath, denied him. His anger at the death of Patroclus burned too fiercely. Hector's final breath drifted into the wind, and the soul of Troy's greatest protector passed into the realm of shadows. Achilles, in his fury, bound Hector's body to his chariot. He dragged it across the dust of the battlefield, a sight of sorrow and despair for the Trojans who watched from the walls. Priam cried out in grief, tearing his garments in anguish. Hecuba wailed, her voice echoing with the pain of a mother's heart. And Andromache, seeing her beloved husband's fate, collapsed in sorrow, her world shattered. The duel was over, but its meaning endured. It was more than a battle between two men. It was the struggle between duty and rage, between love and vengeance, between the mortal heart and the will of the gods. In this quiet telling, we remember Hector not only as a warrior, but as a man who stood for his people, who faced his fate with courage, and who left behind a legacy of honor. And we remember Achilles, too, whose greatness was marred by wrath, whose story reminds us of the fragility of even the mightiest heart. As the sun set that day, Troy was cloaked in mourning, and the Greeks, though victorious in the duel, felt the heavy weight of destiny moving closer. For though Hector had fallen, the war was not yet over, and the gods had more to weave into the tapestry of fate. As the long years of the Trojan War stretched on, both sides suffered under the weight of exhaustion, grief, and endless fighting. The Greeks, though still powerful, felt their strength waning, for their greatest warrior, Achilles, remained withdrawn in his tent, his heart filled with anger toward Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek host. Without Achilles, the balance of battle tilted dangerously, and the Trojans pressed harder each day. In this chapter, let us move gently into the story of one of the most important attempts to mend the broken bond, the embassy to Achilles. It was not a scene of violence or sword clashes, but rather one of words, persuasion, and quiet pleading, a reminder that sometimes the fate of empires rests upon conversations in the stillness of the night. The Greek leaders had gathered in their council tent after a difficult day of battle. The Trojans, led by Hector, had driven the Greeks back toward their ships, and the flames of despair flickered in every corner of the camp. Many warriors felt that without Achilles, there was little hope of pushing back the tide of Trojan assaults. Agamemnon, who had once insulted and dishonored Achilles, now saw the weight of his pride pressing heavily upon him. The arrogance that had led to their quarrel had brought disaster. The High King admitted, with bitter reluctance, that he had been wrong. To mend the fracture, he resolved to send an embassy, an offering of gifts and words of reconciliation, to Achilles. The choice of envoys was made carefully. Odysseus, the cleverest of the Greeks, known for his silver tongue and calm wisdom, would be one. Ajax, towering and strong, a man Achilles respected for his honesty and courage, would be another. And Phoenix, the elder and mentor of Achilles since boyhood, would join them, for his voice carried the weight of affection and memory. The three men set out under the quiet veil of night, the stars above them shimmering faintly, as though the heavens themselves watched with breathless anticipation. Their footsteps were measured, their expressions heavy with the responsibility of their mission. They walked through the silent camp where tired soldiers rested, and the faint crackle of dying campfires whispered around them. Soon, they came upon Achilles' dwelling. Achilles sat within his tent, not armored for war but clothed in simple garments, his great heart still burning with resentment. By his side was Patroclus, his closest companion, who often sought to calm his anger and remind him of loyalty to the Greeks. As the envoys entered, Achilles welcomed them with the courtesy that was his nature, despite his fury at Agamemnon. He offered food and drink, as tradition demanded, for in those ancient times hospitality was sacred, even when bitterness lingered between men. The envoys sat, and the quiet murmur of the night seemed to close in around them. It was Odysseus who spoke first, his words carefully chosen, as if each one were a step across a fragile bridge. He recounted the plight of the Greeks, the desperate struggles on the battlefield, the threat of ruin if Achilles did not return. He described Agamemnon's regret, his promise of rich gifts to atone for the insult. The High King, Odysseus said, would return Briseis, the maiden who had been taken, untouched and unharmed. Along with her, he would send treasures, gold, silver, horses, and cities promised as reward. But beyond gifts, Odysseus appealed to Achilles' sense of glory, reminding him that his fate was bound with eternal fame if he rejoined the war. The world would remember him, songs would carry his name through the ages, and his deeds would shine brighter than the stars. When Odysseus finished, a hush lingered. Achilles, his eyes fixed upon the ground, spoke with a voice heavy with pain. He admitted that no gifts could heal the wound to his honor, nor ease the insult he had suffered. To him, Agamemnon's apology felt hollow, a shadow of sincerity. Achilles spoke of the brevity of life, of how even the bravest men must meet death, and wondered aloud why men should throw themselves into endless battles for another's pride. His words were not fiery, but sorrowful, as though he carried not only anger but also deep weariness. He revealed that his mother, the goddess Thetis, had told him of two fates, to live a long but quiet life at home, or to die young in battle but win everlasting glory. For the moment, Achilles chose life over fame. Next, Phoenix rose, his voice trembling with the tenderness of one who had watched Achilles grow from a child into a warrior. He reminded Achilles of the bond they shared, of nights long ago when he had cradled the boy in his arms, teaching him the ways of the world. Phoenix spoke of his own sorrows, of how he had found refuge in Achilles' household, and how he loved him as a father loves a son. His plea was not for gifts or glory, but for compassion, for the Greeks who bled, for the friends who fought, for the bond of loyalty that once held them together. Achilles listened in silence, his heart stirred, but his resolve did not break. Finally, Ajax spoke, his words plain and without ornament. He reminded Achilles that stubbornness brought only destruction, and that even enemies could reconcile. He urged Achilles to put aside pride and think of his comrades, those who stood in battle with spears raised, calling upon his strength. The silence after their speeches was heavy, as though the tent itself held its breath. Achilles responded with calm but unwavering firmness. He thanked his friends for their loyalty, for their effort to sway him. Yet his heart remained unmoved. He declared that he would not return to the battle until the Trojans set fire to the Greek ships, threatening the very lifeline of the army. Only then, he said, might he consider lifting his spear again. The envoys realized their mission had failed. With sorrowful hearts, they returned to Agamemnon and the Greek camp, carrying the bitter news that Achilles' wrath endured. The war would continue without him, and the Greeks would have to face the rising tide of Trojan fury alone. And so, the embassy to Achilles became one of the most poignant moments of the war, not a clash of steel, but a clash of pride, pain, and the deep struggle between honor and reconciliation. It showed how words, though powerful, can sometimes fall short against the weight of human emotion. As the night deepened over Troy and the Greek camp, the stars watched in silence. The war was not yet decided, and destiny still held its secrets. But in that quiet night, as the envoys' footsteps faded into the distance, the shadow of Achilles' absence loomed larger than ever. The war had reached its breaking point. The Greeks, weary and battered, had been pushed to their limits by the relentless might of the Trojans. Hector, the noble defender of Troy, had driven the Greeks back to their very ships. Fires burned near the beach as the Trojans threatened to consume the fleet and trap the Greeks forever on the shores of Ilium. Despair spread like smoke through the camp, and the murmurs of defeat filled the hearts of even the bravest warriors. Yet in their greatest need, one name was whispered again and again: Achilles. The mighty son of Peleus, the warrior who had once led them with unstoppable strength, still sat apart, in his tent, untouched by battle, nursing his pride and anger against Agamemnon. Without him, the Greeks faltered. With him, perhaps, they could endure. And so the leaders of the army gathered. Agamemnon, burdened by guilt and desperation, proposed an embassy, an appeal to Achilles himself. If pride had torn them apart, perhaps gifts, apologies, and persuasion could mend what was broken. The task would not be easy, for Achilles' wrath was deep. Still, hope demanded it. The embassy was chosen with care. Odysseus, master of cunning words, Ajax, the towering warrior of great heart, and Phoenix, the old and trusted tutor of Achilles, who had cared for him as a child. These three would carry the pleas of the entire army into the tent of the greatest warrior the Greeks had ever known. Under the stars, with the night heavy and quiet, they made their way across the sand toward the tent of Achilles. The sound of the sea lapping gently upon the shore was their only companion, and in the distance, the fires of Troy glimmered like the eyes of watchful gods. Inside his tent, Achilles sat with Patroclus, his dearest companion. The anger that burned within him had long since turned into something colder: disappointment, disillusionment, a distance from the war itself. He knew the Greeks needed him. He also knew his heart remained unmoved. When the three envoys arrived, Achilles greeted them with courtesy. For though he raged against Agamemnon, he still respected these men, especially Phoenix, who was like a second father to him. Food and wine were brought forth, as custom demanded, and they shared a meal before the words that truly mattered were spoken. Odysseus spoke first. His voice was calm, practiced, and steady. He told Achilles of the desperate plight of the army, of the Trojans pressing hard against the ships, of the fires that licked so close to their escape. He reminded him of the glory that was his by right, and of the gifts Agamemnon now offered: great treasures, lands, women, and honor restored. Agamemnon, Odysseus said, admitted his wrongs and sought to mend the rift with generosity. Achilles listened, silent, his eyes steady but unmoving. When Odysseus finished, the great warrior spoke, his words slow, like a tide that rolled heavy upon the shore. Odysseus, he said, you are skilled with words, and your plea is worthy. But my heart is not swayed. Agamemnon insulted me before all, robbed me of my prize, and dishonored me. Let him keep his gifts. Let him keep his women. Nothing can erase the wound he dealt my pride. Why should I fight for him, when he values me so little? His voice carried no anger now, only cold certainty. He spoke further, of how fleeting human life was, how little the gods cared for the struggles of mortals. What is glory to me, he said, if my life is shortened by it? Would it not be better to return home, to live in peace, far from the quarrels of kings? Ajax, the man of action, spoke next. His words were not clever or ornate, but simple and strong, like his spirit. He reminded Achilles that the army was not Agamemnon alone. The men who fought, who bled, who died, these were his comrades. They needed him. Without him, they would perish, and their homes would fall silent forever. Still, Achilles remained firm. I pity them, he said, but my choice is made. I will not fight. Not for Agamemnon. Not while my heart is wounded. At last, Phoenix spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of memory and love. He told Achilles of his childhood, of how he had guided him, taught him, loved him as a father. His words were not of war or honor, but of family, of bonds too deep to be broken by pride. He begged Achilles to reconsider, to let go of wrath, and to remember the love that bound him to the Greeks. For a moment, Phoenix's words seemed to touch him. Achilles' silence grew long, and Patroclus looked upon his friend with hope. But then Achilles shook his head. "Old friend," he said softly, "I honor you, and I love you. But my heart will not change. The Greeks must find another way. I will not fight until the Trojans bring fire to my own ships. Only then will my hand return to battle." And so, with heavy hearts, the envoys departed. They had come with hope, but they left with despair. The fate of the Greeks still hung in the balance, and their greatest warrior remained apart. Yet even in his refusal, Achilles had left a crack in the door. For he had spoken of fire upon his ships, of a point where his patience would end. And the gods, who guided the fates of men, were already weaving the threads that would bring that fire closer. As the embassy returned through the darkened night, the sound of the sea still in their ears, they knew the war would rage on, fiercer than before. And though Achilles' heart was unyielding, the hour was coming when destiny itself would summon him back to the field. The night was heavy with silence, yet within that silence, the future stirred. The city of Troy had stood for 10 long years against the might of Greece. Its walls, tall and unbroken, seemed destined never to fall. The Greeks had tried everything, direct assault, cunning raids, and endless patience, but Troy endured. Yet, as often happens in the long arc of human stories, victory did not come by strength of arms, but by the quiet weaving of deception. The plan was born in the mind of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, known not for sheer force but for his cleverness. He saw what years of bloodshed had not accomplished. The walls of Troy were too strong to climb, too deep to dig beneath, too solid to batter down. Only a trick, he reasoned, could open the gates. And so he proposed a stratagem that would be whispered in tales for all time, the building of the great wooden horse. The Greeks, weary and desperate, agreed to his idea. Carpenters and soldiers worked together to craft a towering horse of wood, hollow within, large enough to hide chosen warriors. It was a symbol of offering, a guise of surrender, a false gift to the gods. The Greeks pretended to sail away, their ships hidden beyond a nearby island, leaving behind only the horse as if in tribute to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. When the Trojans awoke and found the vast horse upon the plain, they were filled with wonder and confusion. Some believed it to be a sign of peace, a token of Greek surrender. Others suspected danger, but their voices were few. Among those who warned against it was Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, who cried out to his people, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." He hurled his spear at the horse, and the wood shuddered with the sound of hollow emptiness, echoing like a secret breath trapped within. But fate, as the poets say, was against Troy. At that very moment, serpents from the sea, great and coiling, rose from the waters and struck down Laocoon and his sons. The Trojans saw this as divine punishment for insulting the sacred gift. Their doubts dissolved, and they believed the horse was indeed holy. With rejoicing, they dragged it into the city, breaking their own walls to make room for its size. The streets filled with celebration, music, and dancing, for they thought the war was over at last. As night fell, Troy sank into revelry. Wine flowed, songs rose, and the fires of festivity burned brightly in the courtyards. Exhausted from years of war, the Trojans surrendered to joy and sleep. They dreamed of peace, of children playing without fear, of fields unscarred by battle. The city that had held out for so long was now unguarded, lulled into false safety. Within the hollow horse, Greek warriors lay in silence. Among them were Odysseus, Menelaus, Diomedes, and others chosen for their courage and stealth. They waited, hearts pounding in the darkness, until the signal came. At midnight, when the city slept deeply, the hidden door of the horse was opened. The warriors slipped out like shadows and quickly moved to the gates. They signaled to the ships waiting beyond the shore, and the Greek army, which had only pretended to retreat, returned with fury. The gates of Troy were thrown open, and the Greek host poured inside. Flames rose swiftly as houses were set alight. The clang of weapons rang out, shattering the night. Troy, which had withstood a decade of siege, crumbled in a single night of betrayal. Priam, the old king, tried to resist, but he was struck down within his palace. Hecuba, his queen, was taken captive, her crown of sorrow heavier than any jewel. Andromache, the widow of Hector, saw her child torn from her arms, the boy hurled from the walls to prevent the rise of a future avenger. The city that had once flourished with temples, markets, and gardens was consumed by fire and grief. Amidst the chaos, Aeneas, a prince of Troy, gathered his family and followers. Guided, some say, by the gods themselves, he fled the burning city, carrying his aged father upon his back and holding the hand of his young son. His journey, though born from ruin, would become the seed of another story, the founding of a distant empire yet to rise. The Greeks, though victors, were not spared the bitterness of their deeds. For even as Troy fell, shadows of fate stretched toward them. Many would not live to enjoy their triumph. Some ships would be lost to storms, some heroes would never see their homelands again. Odysseus, the mastermind of the horse, would wander for years across seas and islands before reaching Ithaca. Agamemnon, the high king, would be slain by his own wife upon his return. Victory, it seemed, carried with it its own curse. The fall of Troy was not just the end of a war. It was the ending of an age, the breaking of a city that had stood as a beacon of wealth and pride. Its ruins would whisper through time, a reminder of how even the strongest walls may fall when trust and hope are turned against them. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, the silence was heavy. The laughter of the night before was gone, replaced by the cries of the defeated. The horse, now charred by fire, stood as a grim monument, a reminder of the cunning that had undone a nation. Troy was no more, and the world would never forget the tale. And so the story tells us of the fragility of human triumphs, of the way joy can mask danger, and of how fate moves unseen until the moment it strikes. The fall of Troy is not only a tale of war, but also a lesson that speaks softly through history, of hubris, of trust misplaced, and of the delicate line between victory and ruin. The city of Troy had fallen, its walls crumbled, and its streets filled with smoke and sorrow. What had stood proud for 10 long years was now reduced to ruins, and the echoes of battle had faded into an eerie quiet. The Greeks, victorious at last, moved through the city, their steps heavy with exhaustion and reflection. Though they had achieved what they had sought for so long, the price of triumph weighed upon them. Victory, after all, was never without its shadow. In the aftermath, the campfires of the Greek army glimmered across the plains. Some men wept in silence, mourning comrades lost, while others walked aimlessly, staring at the blackened remains of Troy's once proud temples and houses. The destruction was complete, and yet there was a strange stillness in the air. Even the wind seemed to mourn, carrying ashes across the plain and whispering through broken walls. Among the Greeks, Odysseus, the architect of Troy's fall, moved quietly through the city. He walked past the charred remains of the palace, past heaps of treasure and the bodies of those who had once been proud, and he felt the weight of his own cunning. The war had been won, but the cost of deceit, the lives lost, and the grief wrought upon Troy's people lingered in his mind. Even the cleverest of men cannot escape the shadow of conscience, and Odysseus felt it, soft yet insistent, like the echo of distant waves. Not all Greeks returned home immediately. Some lingered, tending to their wounded, collecting what remained of their fallen comrades, and securing their ships. The leaders held councils, debating the next course of action, and reflecting on the lessons of a war that had lasted a decade. Among these discussions, one truth became clear: the war, though concluded, would echo in hearts and lands for generations. The Trojans who survived, the women, children, and a few warriors, were taken as captives or scattered to distant lands. Hecuba, the grieving queen, and Cassandra, the prophetess who foresaw doom but could not prevent it, were carried away in chains, their voices filled with lamentations. Andromache, the widow of Hector, mourned silently, her heart heavy with the loss of her husband and the destruction of her home. Even Aeneas, who fled with his family, carried the burden of grief alongside the hope of future beginnings. Amid the sorrow and ruin, the Greek heroes prepared for their return journeys. Some, like Menelaus, yearned to see their homes once more, imagining the familiar shores and faces they had left behind. Others, like Ajax and Agamemnon, contemplated the fates awaiting them, aware that the gods often tempered human joy with trials. And Achilles, though yet alive, remained distant, his wrath eventually giving way to the quiet sorrow of loss, the cost of a war he had fought with such ferocity. The return to Greece was not swift. Storms and tempests struck the ships along the Aegean, scattering fleets and prolonging the journey. Many would face long years of wandering, their trials reflecting the lessons of the war, that human ambition and pride, even when justified, are never free from consequences. The journeys became tales of endurance, courage, and reflection, as each warrior faced both the sea and his own inner struggles. Even after the battle ceased, the memory of Troy lingered. Its walls, though fallen, were remembered by poets and storytellers. Its fall became a symbol not merely of conquest but of human vulnerability, the way trust, hope, and misjudgment can shape destiny. Each Greek and Trojan who survived carried these lessons within, soft yet enduring, like whispers along the wind. In quiet moments, under the stars, the survivors would sometimes remember Hector, noble and steadfast, the defender of Troy. They would recall the bravery of men and women who stood against the tides of war, who loved their city and each other deeply, even when the end was inevitable. And the echoes of that long conflict, told in gentle words and soft tones, became a lullaby of history, a reminder that courage, loss, and hope are intertwined, and that even in the aftermath of tragedy, life continues to move forward. The Greeks, having witnessed the consequences of 10 years of war, learned to carry humility alongside triumph. They understood that victory is tempered by sorrow, that even the proudest city can fall when fate and cunning intersect. And so, as the sun rose over the Aegean, painting the waves with soft gold, the survivors set their sights on home, each step measured, each thought tinged with reflection. In this quiet telling, the fall of Troy is more than the end of a battle. It is a meditation on human nature, on the fragility of ambition, and on the gentle persistence of memory. The city's ruins, though silent, speak across the centuries. They speak of the resilience of those who endure, of the bonds of family and friendship, and of the quiet moments in which courage and sorrow coexist. Thus, the story of Troy, in its devastation and its aftermath, becomes a lesson not in heroics alone, but in reflection. And as we imagine the survivors drifting across the waves toward home, we are reminded that even after the darkest nights, there is the gentle promise of dawn. The long years of war had ended, the fires of Troy had burned themselves into memory, and the dust of its ruins had settled upon the earth. Yet for the Greeks, the journey was far from over. Even after victory, the path home was uncertain, filled with trials and reflections, for the gods themselves had not finished weaving the fates of those who survived. The ships of the Greeks set sail once more, their sails catching the soft winds of the Aegean. Men who had spent a decade of their lives in battle now faced the open sea, a vast expanse of water that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Waves lapped gently against the hulls, yet the sailors knew that calm waters could quickly turn to storms. They carried not only the spoils of war but also the weight of grief, the memories of comrades lost, and the lingering shadows of deeds done under the veil of necessity. Odysseus, the clever and wary king of Ithaca, led his fleet with caution. Though his cunning had brought the Greeks victory, it had also drawn the attention of the gods. Poseidon, god of the sea, harbored anger at the hero's cleverness, and the wind and waves would not always favor him. His journey would be long, filled with detours, islands of peril, and encounters with beings both mortal and divine. But Odysseus pressed on, guided by a mixture of wit, courage, and hope, dreaming of the shores of Ithaca where his family waited patiently. Menelaus, king of Sparta, sailed with heavy heart. His wife, Helen, the cause of the war, was beside him, her beauty both a blessing and a reminder of what had begun the conflict. They returned to their homeland, yet their hearts had been shaped by 10 years of grief and sacrifice. They carried with them the lessons of honor, love, and the fragility of human ambition, realizing that even kings must endure the consequences of their desires. Other warriors faced harsher fates. Ajax, the mighty and steadfast, would find his homecoming clouded by misfortune, and Agamemnon, the high king, would not survive long upon his return. The lessons of the war extended beyond the battlefield. Pride, anger, and unchecked ambition could bring sorrow as swiftly as the enemy's spear. The Greeks learned that even in triumph, life demanded humility and care. And yet, amid these trials, there was hope. Aeneas, the Trojan prince who had fled the city, journeyed toward distant lands with his father and son, carrying within him the seed of a new beginning. Though Troy was lost, its spirit endured, carried by those who survived to shape the future. This too is a lesson of the Trojan War, that even in the wake of destruction, life continues, and new stories are born from the ashes of the old. The memory of Troy persisted, not only in the hearts of those who had survived but also in the songs and tales told across generations. Minstrels sang softly of Hector, noble and brave, who had defended his city with all the courage in his heart. They spoke of Achilles, whose wrath and sorrow were as legendary as his strength. They whispered the deeds of Odysseus, cunning and patient, whose mind shaped the tide of war. These stories were carried from home to home, across lands and seas, and became a gentle reminder of the complexity of courage, honor, and human emotion. Even in quiet reflection, the lessons of Troy were clear. The war had been not merely a contest of armies but a test of human nature. It showed the cost of anger, the price of pride, and the fragile threads upon which cities and lives depend. The Greeks returned home, forever changed by what they had seen, carrying with them wisdom born of sorrow as well as joy, grief as well as triumph. At last, the men reached their homes, greeted by loved ones, familiar shores, and the calm embrace of life beyond war. Families reunited, and the weary warriors slept once more under familiar roofs. The sound of waves against the shore, the whisper of winds through the trees, and the quiet murmur of daily life became a soothing balm to hearts that had known too long the roar of battle. And so, the story of Troy came to rest, its echoes carried softly through the ages. It was a tale not only of war but of humanity, the courage to fight, the love that motivates sacrifice, the grief that follows loss, and the hope that persists even in the darkest hours. The Trojan War teaches that history is made not only in the clash of swords but in the quiet reflection of what those events mean to those who endure them. As we close this chapter and this story, let us imagine the survivors walking along peaceful shores, their steps gentle upon the sand. Let us hear the quiet laughter of children, the soft songs of mothers, and the tender voices of fathers. The city of Troy may have fallen, yet the spirit of its people, and of all who lived through the war, continues. And the Greek warriors, returning to their homes, carry within them the knowledge that every life touched by conflict holds the power to remember, to reflect, and to find peace. In this soft and gentle way, the tale of Troy drifts into memory. Its walls, its heroes, its struggles and triumphs, all become whispers in the wind. And as we listen, we understand that history, even in its most violent moments, can be told with care, reflection, and calm. For through stories, both loud and quiet, we carry forward the lessons of the past, the courage of those who fought, and the enduring hope that light follows even the darkest night. Thus, the Trojan War, with all its battles, sorrows, and heroism, comes to its final rest. And as the stars above Ilium fade into the morning, we find peace in the knowledge that even in the end, stories endure, softly, like a lullaby carried across the ages.